The air that night was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and an unspoken tension, so heavy you could slice it with a butter knife. The Miller family Thanksgiving dinner. A ritual of forced smiles and inherited grudges. At the head of the table sat my father, David Miller, the patriarch, a man whose face was as weathered and unyielding as the empire he'd built. To his right, my older brother, Marcus, the heir apparent, his jaw set in a permanent line of entitled expectation. To his left, Ethan, the golden son, forever searching for a legacy he was born to inherit. And then there was me, Alethea, the ghost in the room, the daughter my father had always seen as a distraction, a frivolous whisper in the halls of his male-dominated fortress. He saw my interests in technology as a hobby, a phase. He saw my mind as a mystery he had no time to solve. He saw me as nothing, and I let him. For 30 years, I hid in plain sight, a silent observer in a family of thunderous egos. Little did they know, while they were busy fighting for a seat at the table, I was building my own. The clinking of silverware stopped. The polite chatter died. My father cleared his throat, a sound that echoed through the silence, like a judge's gavel. He stood, his shoulders hunched, his voice strained. He was not giving a toast. He was delivering a eulogy. "This is it," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of his sons. The end of the line. My father was a man who spoke in absolutes, in declarations of conquest and command. He never spoke of endings. He never spoke of defeat. He announced that he was selling Miller and Sons, the century-old empire that was meant to be our inheritance, our legacy, our entire lives. He said there would be no transfer of power, no golden parachute, no future for his sons in a company their ancestors had poured their lives into. The air turned to ice. Marcus shot up from his chair, his face a mask of betrayal. "What do you mean, no inheritance?" he bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging. "This is our birthright. You can't just give it away." Ethan, ever the diplomat, ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, what's going on? Who are you selling to?" Their voices were filled with a raw, visceral desperation, the sound of men watching their entire identity unravel before their very eyes. They were begging for an explanation, for a lifeline, for the future they had been promised since birth. But as my father was destroying my brother's dreams, my phone was lighting up with a deal that would change everything. The vibration against my thigh was a rhythmic, insistent hum, a secret language only I understood. It was an email, a single monumental offer, $47 million. The subject line was a masterpiece of corporate nonchalance. Acquisition offer, Stealth Mode Incorporated. A few months prior, I had launched an AI-powered logistics platform, a project I'd been secretly building in my spare time for over 5 years. It was born from a simple desire to fix the broken, archaic supply chain of the very company my family was now watching crumble. While they were fighting for the past, I was building the future. They thought I was a daydreamer, a quiet girl with a passion for complicated code. They saw me as the forgotten daughter, the one who didn't fit into their world of steel and concrete. They had no idea I had built an empire of my own, an empire made of data and algorithms, an empire they couldn't even see. My father's voice droned on, a mournful dirge for a life he felt was ending. But I wasn't listening. My focus was on the email, on the numbers, on the single, elegant stroke of fortune. The offer wasn't just a number, it was validation. It was an escape. It was the moment the ghost in the room became the architect of her own destiny. While my brothers were mourning a loss, I was celebrating a win. They were losing a company. I was gaining a future. And the irony of it all, the sweet, magnificent irony, was not lost on me. While they were fighting over the scraps of a dying dynasty, I was being handed the keys to my own kingdom. But before I reveal how this brilliant woman got her revenge, smash that like button if you love seeing underdogs win big. The Miller legacy wasn't just a business. It was a religion, a sacred text passed down from father to son for 4 generations. My great-grandfather, Arthur Miller, founded Miller and Sons on a simple, ironclad principle. The only thing more reliable than our gears is our bloodline. It wasn't just a motto. It was a prophecy, a promise, a chain of command as rigid and unyielding as the steel we forged. My grandfather, then my father, had all been meticulously groomed for their roles. From the moment they could walk, they were brought into the factory, their small hands learning the cold weight of a wrench, their eyes learning to read blueprints before they could read bedtime stories. They were the anointed ones, the chosen lineage. They were the sons. And then there was me. I was the asterisk, the footnote, the unexpected plot twist in an otherwise predictable saga. My father saw me as a bonus mind, a charming little accessory to his two future pillars of industry. My brothers, Marcus and Ethan, were given board games that simulated corporate takeovers. I was given dolls. They were taken to the factory floor to watch the furnaces roar. I was taken to ballet classes. It was a calculated, systematic process of grooming and dismissal, a constant, unspoken reminder of my place in the family on the periphery. But while they were learning about profit margins and supply chains, I was learning about something else entirely. I was learning about systems, about patterns, about the quiet hum of logic that underpins everything. While Marcus was arguing with my father about stock prices, I was disassembling our family's broken VCR and rebuilding it from memory. While Ethan was learning to schmooze clients, I was building my own computer from scavenged parts, teaching myself to code with a tenacity that came from a deep internal well of defiance. My childhood genius was never a threat, never a sign of something more. It was cute eccentricity, a fascinating hobby that my father would occasionally trot out at dinner parties like a trained pet. "Look what Alethea did," he would say with a proud, paternal smile, as if my ability to write complex algorithms was on par with a particularly well-executed finger painting. When I got my acceptance letter to MIT, it was another moment of paternal pride, but with a telling undercurrent of distance. My father saw it as a personal achievement, a testament to his good parenting, not as an asset to the family business. He even joked that I would finally be able to get a real job and stop playing with my little code projects. The dismissal wasn't malicious, it was worse. It was born of a profound, blinding ignorance. He simply couldn't comprehend that a mind as brilliant as mine could ever be a part of the Miller legacy, because the legacy was for sons. My ideas, my innovations were always welcome at the periphery. A side project, a suggestion for a minor efficiency upgrade, a fleeting spark of brilliance that could be safely admired from a distance. But they were never, ever allowed at the core. The core was reserved for my brothers, for their ideas, for their future. The psychological wall was a silent, invisible force field I hit again and again, a constant, bruising reminder that I would never be an equal heir. The moment of crystallization came during my final year at MIT. I had developed a revolutionary AI-driven inventory management system, a program so elegant and efficient it could cut Miller & Sons operating costs by 30%. I flew home, full of hope, armed with a detailed presentation and an eagerness to finally, truly contribute. I presented it to my father and brothers in the conference room. They listened politely. They smiled and nodded. And when I was done, my father patted me on the shoulder, his touch condescendingly paternal. "That's lovely, sweetheart," he said, as if I had shown him a macaroni art project. "But our system works just fine." My brothers' eyes glazed over, their minds already on the next golf game, the next business trip. In that moment, watching their polite indifference, I realized the truth with a cold, piercing clarity. I wasn't an heir. I was a guest. I would never be seen as an equal, not in this family, not in this company. My brilliance was a burden, a thing to be tolerated, not a tool to be leveraged. That's when I stopped trying to prove myself to them. That's when I decided to build my own legacy. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Boston, the rent paid for with the coding jobs I'd secretly taken on in college. I wasn't just building a company. I was building a deliberate, emphatic rejection of everything the Miller name stood for. I named my company Viridian Technologies. The name came from the Latin word for green, a nod to new life, to a vibrant future, to a legacy born not of rust and steel, but of innovation and a different kind of strength. I wasn't interested in the cold, unfeeling machinery of industry. I was interested in the human element they had so willfully ignored. I focused on empathy-driven robotics, developing AI companions for the elderly and disabled. My first product, Clarity, was a small, unobtrusive robot that used advanced AI to manage medication schedules, monitor vital signs, and provide companionship through a gentle, intuitive interface. It was a success, but it was just the beginning. I used the profits to fund my next, more ambitious project, the very logistics platform that was now being acquired. My business was built on a foundation of care, of understanding, of a deep-seated belief that technology should serve people, not just profits. It was a stark contrast to the legacy of Miller and Sons, a company that saw its workforce as cogs in a machine. And my leadership team? It was a deliberate rejection of the patriarchal structure I had grown up with. My head of engineering was a woman who had been passed over for a promotion at a major tech company. My head of marketing was a single mother who had been told her childcare responsibilities would be a distraction. We were a collective of misfits, of outsiders, of brilliant women who had been dismissed by a world built for men. We were a different kind of dynasty, a sorority of geniuses united by a shared history of being underestimated. We were a quiet revolution happening in a small apartment, a shadow empire that was about to eclipse the very name that had tried to keep me in the dark. And if you're enjoying this underdog story, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. Trust me, this revenge gets sweet. The greatest advantage I had was the one they had gifted me: invisibility. While my family was consumed by their own internal drama, arguing over the past and panicking about a future they no longer controlled, I was building my empire in the shadows. I adopted a pseudonym, a simple, non-gendered name for all my business dealings. I signed every document, every contract, every non-disclosure agreement with a legal name I had created for my clandestine corporate self. No one knew I was Alethea Miller, the forgotten daughter. I was simply the founder of Viridian Technologies, a name whispered with growing awe in the tech world. To fund my early ventures, I approached female venture capitalists, women who understood my vision and, more importantly, had experienced the same systemic dismissals I had. They saw not a bonus mind, but a genuine innovator. They saw the future in my algorithms, the humanity in my robotics. We formed a cabal of ambition, a powerful network of women who had been overlooked for too long. My first major backer was a woman who had been told her emotional intelligence was a weakness. She became my co-conspirator, my strategic partner, and my biggest champion. We operated with the ruthless efficiency of a force that has nothing to lose. Our secrecy was our psychological shield. It protected me from their doubt, their condescension, their well-meaning but ultimately destructive attempts to help. They could not hinder what they could not see. The growth was not just fast, it was exponential. My first few months were a grind, long nights fueled by coffee and a burning desire to prove them all wrong. I remember the thrill of my first $1,000 in revenue, the feeling of real, tangible success that had nothing to do with the Miller name. That quickly became $10,000, then $100,000. My initial investment, a small loan from my VCs, was recouped within a year. But the real game changer was the logistics platform. I built it to solve the inefficiencies I had seen firsthand at Miller and Sons, a program so intuitive and powerful it could optimize a global supply chain in seconds. It was a masterpiece of code, a direct answer to the problems my family refused to acknowledge. The day a major shipping company signed on, our revenue jumped from the tens of thousands to the millions. We were no longer a startup. We were a force. And my family had no idea I was the one behind it. The irony of it all was a constant, bittersweet companion. As Viridian soared, Miller and Sons stagnated. I watched from the outside, a ghost at the feast. I saw the news articles about their stock performance, the analyst reports that described the company as a dinosaur waiting for its asteroid. The once proud empire was crumbling from within, its foundation weakened by technological obsolescence. My father, who had once held court with the confidence of a king, now seemed weary, his shoulders hunched not with the weight of command, but with the burden of defeat. I saw the dimming fire in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands. He was losing control, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had dismissed my solution, my brilliant, elegant fix. The very system I had built was the one that could have saved his company, could have dragged it into the 21st century. My heart was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. A part of me, the part that had been hurt and dismissed for so long, felt a cold, righteous satisfaction. They had chosen to ignore me, and now they were paying the price. But another part, the part that still loved my father and my brothers, felt a profound sadness, a deep, aching regret. I had the power to save them. My logistics platform could have single-handedly revitalized their dying business. I could have offered it to them for free, as a gift, a final attempt to prove my worth. I could have been their hero, their savior. The thought haunted me, but then I would remember the condescending pat on the shoulder, the dismissive wave of the hand, the years of being a bonus mind. The hurt was a powerful shield against my own compassion. I had to let go of the idea of saving them to save myself. The signs of Miller and Son's decline were no longer just whispers. They were loud, undeniable shouts. The stock price was a flat line, a testament to their refusal to innovate. Competitors were eating their market share. The industry rumors, once just gossip, became more and more concrete. Miller and Sons is looking for a buyer, the trade publications reported. The family is cashing out. David Miller, the man who had proclaimed that his bloodline was more reliable than his gears, was now preparing to sell off his family's legacy. He had broken his great-grandfather's promise. He had destroyed the very foundation he had been given. He was doing to my brothers exactly what I had feared he would do to me. He was taking away their future. And as I sat in my luxurious office, overlooking the very city my family had built, I knew the time was coming. The moment for my silent, secret revenge was drawing near. I had built my empire in the shadows, and now it was time for the world to see the full, magnificent scope of what they had dismissed. Comment below. Would you have revealed your success earlier, or kept building your empire in secret? The clinking of silverware, a gentle, melodic sound that had always defined the Miller Thanksgiving dinner, suddenly felt like the quietest tolling of a funeral bell. The dining room, with its heirloom mahogany table and the hushed glow of candlelight, was an elaborate stage set for a performance no one knew was coming. My father, David Miller, sat at the head, not a king on his throne, but a weary general at the end of a long, losing war. The corporate undertones, once a subtle hum beneath the polite chatter, now vibrated in the air like an oncoming storm. We were a family, yes, but we were also a company, and the last quarter had been devastating. My brothers, Marcus and Ethan, were a study in synchronized tension. Marcus, a man who saw every conversation as a negotiation, was stiff and silent, his jaw clenched, as if chewing on the bad news he knew was coming. Ethan, ever the diplomat, kept glancing at our father, his eyes searching for the reassurance that was no longer there. And me? I was the forgotten variable, a quiet observer in a play I had known was a tragedy for years. I watched my family's elaborate dance of denial and desperation, a ghost at the feast, knowing my invisibility was my greatest power. The turkey, a golden monument to tradition, felt less like a centerpiece and more like a sacrificial offering. David laid down his fork, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. His posture, once so commanding, was now a portrait of profound defeat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet finality of his tone was far more chilling than any shout. "I have something to say," he began, his gaze sweeping over his sons, devoid of its usual paternal pride, replaced with a cold, almost clinical disappointment. "After much deliberation, I've decided to sell Miller and Sons." The words hung in the air, a physical weight. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate, a tiny, defiant rebellion against the coming tide. Ethan looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, his face drained of all color. But the true bombshell came next, a secondary explosion that annihilated any hope of a soft landing. The company will be sold to a consortium. The proceeds will be put into a technical apprenticeship trust in perpetuity to fund the next generation of engineers and manufacturers. There will be no inheritance. The room erupted. Marcus shot out of his chair, the sound of wood scraping against the floor a violent, desperate protest. "What do you mean, no inheritance? That's our legacy, our birthright. You can't just give away the Miller name like it's nothing." His voice was a raw, wounded bellow, the sound of a world-shattering scream trapped in his throat. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, for the keys to the kingdom to be handed to him. Now, not only was there no kingdom, but the very concept of a family legacy had been obliterated by his own father. Ethan was quieter, but his words held a deeper, more profound pain. "Dad, why? Why a trust? Don't you trust us? We can fix this. We can turn it around." His pleas were a desperate attempt to appeal to a father he had always believed was invincible. But the man at the head of the table wasn't invincible anymore. He was just tired. and in that moment, in his decision to leave his entire fortune to an impersonal trust, he was declaring his sons unworthy, unfit, and a terminal disappointment. In the midst of their chaos, I felt a shift within myself, a strange, quiet calm. I had spent years nursing the wound of being an outcast, of being a bonus mind, while my brothers were groomed for greatness. My entire secret empire, my quiet revolution, had been a response to that pain. My motivation had always been simple: to prove that I was just as worthy, just as capable, just as deserving of a place at the core of the family legacy. But sitting there, watching the sheer, brutal finality of my father's decision, I realized something far more profound and heartbreaking. He hadn't just given up on me. He had given up on all of us. He had looked at his two anointed sons, the very heirs he had spent a lifetime molding, and had found them lacking. The sons in Miller and Sons had always been the central thesis of his life, and now he was declaring that the thesis was a failure. My revenge, I realized, wasn't about money. It was about validation. It was about standing up in the rubble of a family legacy and proving that the ghost they never saw was the only one who had been building something real. My heart, which had been a battleground of love and resentment, now found a new, unsettling clarity. This was no longer just about me. This was about dignity. This was about proving that my father was wrong. And that's when it happened. A low, insistent hum against my thigh. My phone. The sound was an imperceptible buzz to everyone else, drowned out by Marcus's furious accusations and Ethan's desperate pleas. But to me, it was a divine signal, a cosmic joke delivered at the exact moment of their ultimate despair. I didn't even need to look at it to know what it was. It was the acquisition offer, the final, irrefutable proof of my worth, arriving at the precise moment my father had declared his entire bloodline worthless. I could feel the cold light of the screen against my jeans, the words acquisition offer, stealth mode incorporated, $47 million, burning their way into my mind. It was the perfect storm. My father, worn down by the onslaught of his sons, finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp, cutting through their anger. "You don't understand," he said, and the pain in his voice was palpable, a crack in the Miller armor. "This isn't an act of punishment. It's an act of mercy. The world has moved on. Our business is obsolete. I couldn't in good conscience hand you a crumbling empire and expect you to save it." He gestured vaguely to Marcus's furious face, to Ethan's desperate eyes. "You are good men, you are smart men, but you are not leaders. You are not ready to lead in this new world. I gave you everything I had, and it wasn't enough. None of you are ready to lead. None of you are ready." The words were a quiet dagger, plunged deep into my heart. My father was looking at his sons as he spoke, but his words were a universal judgment. He had always seen me as unready, as a woman unequipped for the rough and tumble of his world. And now he was admitting that the two men he had groomed were just as lost. The legacy was crumbling in real time. This was the moment. The chaos was building, the accusations flying, the family bonds shattering into a million pieces. And I, the quiet observer, was about to step into the eye of the storm. My mind was clear, my heart was calm. I had waited my whole life for this, and now my quiet observation of the chaos was about to end. The room was a maelstrom of shattered expectations and furious despair. Marcus was still on his feet, his face a contorted mask of rage and betrayal, his words a nonstop torrent of accusations. Ethan was frozen, a silent monument to his father's final judgment. My father, David, had collapsed back into his chair, a man utterly defeated, his gaze fixed on some distant, desolate point in the future where the Miller name was no more. The air was thick with the dust of a crumbling dynasty. It was a symphony of failure. I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The simple act of my rising from the table, a still point in their storm, was enough. My voice, when I spoke, was not a shout, but a clean, sharp blade cutting through the noise. "Please," I said, and the single word was enough. It was not a plea. It was a command. "Everyone sit down." Marcus, mid-sentence in a venomous tirade, paused. He looked at me, a flicker of confusion and annoyance in his eyes. Ethan simply stared. David, however, was the one who saw my resolve. He slowly raised his head, and I watched the flicker of condescension cross his face, the ghost of the man who had always seen me as inconsequential. "Alethea," he said, his voice laced with the final vestiges of his authority. This is a family crisis. What could you possibly add to this? The dismissiveness was a final, insulting gift, the perfect opening for my ultimate move. I didn't answer him directly. I just waited. The sheer, unyielding calm in my posture seemed to do the work for me. Marcus, with a resentful huff, sank back into his chair. Ethan followed suit. The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled not with despair, but with a tense, electric curiosity. They were all staring at me, the ghost at the table a sudden, inexplicable presence in their tragedy. "You're right, Dad," I began, my voice clear and steady. "This is a crisis. You've just announced that the legacy of this family is worthless, that the work of 4 generations is being sold off to a trust because the next generation is not ready." My gaze held his, and I saw a flicker of defiance return to his eyes, a final attempt to assert his authority. I didn't let him. "You looked at Marcus, and you found him unprepared. You looked at Ethan and found him unequipped. You looked at me, and you never even bothered to look at all." The words were a quiet accusation, scalpel slicing open a wound they had all pretended was healed. "I have spent the last 8 years in a 1-bedroom apartment, building a company you never knew existed. You were all so busy looking for the next Miller and Sons, you never noticed the future was being built right under your noses." I let the silence hang, letting the words sink in. "It's not just a project. It's a company. I call it Viridian Technologies." The name meant nothing to Marcus. He scoffed a quick, dismissive sound. "Alethea, what are you talking about? A little startup? This is our lives we're talking about." But then I saw it. The shift. The moment of dawning. Terrifying recognition on my father's face. His eyes, which had been so full of defeat, widened slightly. The name. He had heard the name. Viridian Technologies. He was a man who lived and breathed industry news. He must have read about it, about the mysterious, anonymous company that had been disrupting the tech sector. He just never thought to connect it to the daughter he had dismissed as a hobbyist. "It's not a little startup, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as the truth I was about to deliver. "It's a $200 million company. We have over 500 employees, offices in Boston, London, and Tokyo. We're in every major industry, from logistics to medical robotics. Last year, under a pseudonym, I was named one of the top innovators under 30 in the world. And my company was just awarded Most Disruptive Technology of the Decade." The details piled on top of each other, each one a stone in the heavy weight of their shock. I watched the color drain from my father's face, his disbelief turning to a stunned recognition that was far more painful than anger. Marcus's jaw went slack, his entitled fury replaced with a confused, simmering awe. Ethan's eyes widened to saucers, a mix of pure, unadulterated shock and a flicker of pride I hadn't seen in years. I had their attention now. All of it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The despair was gone, replaced by a tense, electric silence, a frantic search for some way to comprehend the chasm between the Alethea they thought they knew and the Titan who sat before them. And then, a sound I had been waiting for. My phone buzzed again, a simple, non-threatening notification. I picked it up, unlocked the screen, and placed it on the table between us. It was a live video call. I watched my father's eyes lock onto the name displayed on the screen. Serafina Vance, CEO of Aegis Industries. Aegis, the largest tech conglomerate in the world. A company that could buy Miller and Sons with its lunch money. I answered the call, my voice a model of professional calm. "Serafina, so good to hear from you." The video feed showed a woman with a sharp, no-nonsense face, her eyes filled with a familiar fire. "Alethea," she said, her voice a low hum. "I just sent you the final offer. The numbers have been approved. We're ready to proceed with the acquisition of your logistics platform, Stealth Mode. We're offering $47 million for the asset. Is that acceptable?" The number hung in the air, a final lethal blow. It wasn't the total value of my company. It was the price tag for a single subsidiary, a project I had built in my spare time. I saw my father's face crumble. The very technology he had dismissed as a little code project was now being acquired for an amount that dwarfed the value of his own failing empire. I looked up from the phone, my gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. "David, Marcus, Ethan. Their silence was now a form of absolute surrender. I turned my attention back to the screen, my eyes filled with the cold fire of victory. The offer is acceptable, Serafina. I'll send you the signed documents by tomorrow morning. I casually mentioned, almost as an afterthought. We'll discuss the other 3 acquisition offers for my robotics division next week. And with that, I ended the call. I placed the phone back on the table. They watched me, not as their little sister, but as a force they could not comprehend. They were watching a titan, a ghost who had built an empire in their shadows, calmly end the chaos they had created, simply by revealing the truth of who she was. The revenge wasn't just in the money or the success. It was in the fact that they had witnessed the entire, magnificent scope of their own failure, delivered by the very person they had always been too blind to see. The silence that followed my words was not a pause in the conversation. It was a profound, suffocating void, filled only with the deafening sound of a dynasty crumbling. My father, who had always commanded a room with his presence, now looked small and hollowed out. He was staring at me, then at the phone on the table, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the face of his little girl with the corporate titan he had just witnessed. His expression was a horrifying blend of shock, devastation, and a nascent, terrifying understanding. He was a man watching his entire life's work, his entire philosophy, his very definition of family, crumble into dust. Finally, his voice came, a whisper thin and brittle with defeat. "How?" he said, the single word a summation of 1,000 unasked questions. It was not a question of mechanics or business logistics. It was a cry from a man whose worldview had just been annihilated. "How did I not see you?" My brothers, too, had been rendered speechless, but their reactions, once the initial shock wore off, were more complex. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, was the first to find his voice. His anger, once so loud, was now a low, resentful hum. "So what?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frantic frustration. "You built a better company? Congratulations, Alethea. You get the prize. Our lives are still over. Our inheritance is gone." His jealousy was a palpable, bitter thing. He had lost, not just to his father, but to his little sister, the one he had always dismissed. Ethan, however, looked at me with a different kind of anguish. He was not angry, but heartbroken. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why? Why did you hide it? All these years? We were family. Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at them all, at the wreckage of their assumptions, and I knew this was the true reckoning. The revelation was not the end. It was the beginning of the long, painful process of healing. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, and for the first time in my life, I spoke to them not as their daughter or their sister, but as their equal. "Because," I began, my voice clear and steady, "you never gave me a reason to tell you. Because every time I tried to show you a different way, I was dismissed. My ideas were cute. My MIT education was a personal achievement. My technology was a little hobby. You were so busy looking at the name on the door that you never saw the future standing right beside you. You, Marcus," I said, looking him in the eye, "were so consumed by the need to be the heir that you couldn't see the partner you already had. You, Ethan, were so focused on being the dutiful son that you never questioned the father who was setting you up to fail. And you, Dad," my gaze settled on him, on his defeated, broken face, "you told me today that this trust was an act of mercy, a recognition that this new world had no place for your sons. But what you really said was that your entire vision of a legacy was a failure. You were looking for a leader in the mirror of your past, and you never once looked at the reflection of your future." My father's shoulders, which had been so straight and powerful, now seemed to sag under an unbearable weight. He wasn't just a businessman admitting defeat. He was a father admitting his most profound failure. "I saw Miller and Sons," he whispered, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of tears, and I was so proud of the sons that I was blind to everything else. I was looking for an heir while I was dismissing my most capable child. "Forgive me, Alethea," he said, and the words were not a formality, but a gut-wrenching plea. I let his apology hang in the air, not out of cruelty, but because I needed him to truly feel it. I had spent my life craving those words. Now that I had them, they were almost too heavy to bear. "I'm not here for forgiveness," I said, my voice softer but no less firm. "I'm here to offer you a choice." The room fell into another profound silence. This was it, the final act. I laid out my terms, not with the cold calculation of a businesswoman, but with the measured power of a woman who is finally taking control of her own story. I have the logistics platform that would have saved this company years ago. I have a global network of clients and partners. I have the resources, the technology, and the vision to not only save Miller & Sons, but to redefine what it means to be a modern dynasty. I am not a trust. I am not a stranger. I am your family, and I am a resource you cannot afford to lose. I paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. My proposal is this. The sale of Miller & Sons will be called off. My company, Viridian Technologies, will merge with yours. The new entity will be called Miller Technologies. It will be a combination of our legacy and my future. I will be the CEO with absolute final authority. Marcus and Ethan will find new roles within the company, positions that leverage your strengths but report to me. Marcus, your sales acumen is unmatched. You will head our new global outreach division. Ethan, your gift for diplomacy will make you invaluable in strategic partnerships and corporate relations. And you, Dad, I looked at my father, the man who had always been a king. You will step into the advisory position you should have offered me years ago. You will be a mentor, a guide, a respected voice, but you will not be the final authority. My terms were a brutal, unforgiving restructuring of their entire lives. I was taking the power and they had to concede to it. I was offering them a lifeline, but it came with a new reality, one in which they were no longer the rulers, but the lieutenants. The choice, I concluded, my gaze sweeping over all three of them, is simple. You can accept my terms, and we can build a new legacy together on a foundation of respect and recognition. Or you can let the sale go through, lose everything, and watch the Miller name disappear forever. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was no longer filled with despair or shock, but with a palpable, agonizing choice. I watched my father's face, 1,000 emotions battling within him. Pride, defeat, a quiet awe, and a glimmer of hope that he had never expected to feel again. My brothers, for the first time in their lives, were looking at me not as a sister or a rival, but as a leader. The revenge wasn't in the money. It was in this moment. The ultimate victory wasn't in their humiliation, but in the fact that they were finally, truly seeing me. And in that moment of reckoning, a new dynasty was born, not of blood and tradition, but of a quiet genius who had built her own power in the shadows and was now ready to lead her family and their legacy into the light. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner was not a single moment of triumph, but a series of cascading consequences that rippled through my family and my industry. The silence of the dining room was eventually broken, not by words, but by the slow, deliberate nods of my brothers. Marcus, the man who had been defined by his birthright, looked at me with a new, grudging respect. His surrender was not just a concession to my power, but a humbling admission of his own limitations. Ethan's gaze was filled with a mix of awe and relief, as if a weight he didn't even know he was carrying had finally been lifted. My father, with a quiet, choked voice, simply said, "Yes." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal and corporate restructuring. The family dynamics, once as rigid as the steel we forged, were now fluid and chaotic. My brothers, who had been raised to be masters of their universe, were now my employees. The transition was not without friction. There were hushed arguments, moments of wounded pride, and a lingering resentment from Marcus. But it was all tempered by the undeniable reality of my success. They were no longer the sons of Miller & Sons. They were key players in my empire, and their positions were no longer a birthright, but a privilege earned through hard work and a commitment to my vision. The industry, meanwhile, was in a frenzy. The news of the Miller & Sons sale being called off, followed by the revelation of the Viridian Technologies merger, was a bombshell. Profile pieces were written about the secret tech heiress, the mysterious founder who had emerged from nowhere to save a dying legacy. I was no longer Aletheia, the forgotten daughter. I was the architect of a new kind of empire, a force to be reckoned with. The media attention was intense, but it was not about scandal or gossip. It was about a story of quiet determination, triumphing over loud entitlement. My identity, once a carefully guarded secret, was now a symbol of a new era. My revenge was not just about wealth. It was about the profound satisfaction of validation and recognition. It was about a victory far more meaningful than any number on a spreadsheet. My inheritance was not the money my father would have left me, but the very company I built from nothing. I had achieved everything I ever wanted, not by waiting for permission, but by taking action in the shadows. My true triumph was in breaking generational patterns of gender bias. For 4 generations, the Miller legacy had been built on the principle of sons. I had shattered that tradition. The new company, Miller Technologies, was a symbolic victory, a name that honored the family legacy but removed the patriarchal chains that had held it back. The new foundation was built on merit, not on bloodline, on a fierce determination to innovate rather than clinging to tradition. My greatest triumph was not just in creating a successful business, but in creating a new kind of legacy, one that could be built by anyone, regardless of their last name or gender. The true meaning of inheritance, I learned, is not a birthright, but a gift earned through merit. My brothers were given the world on a silver platter, but I had to build my own. Their loud entitlement, the years of expecting their legacy to be handed to them, was their ultimate downfall. My quiet determination, my willingness to work in anonymity, was my greatest strength. The price of underestimating someone's potential, I realized, is not just losing out on a good idea, it's losing your entire future. In the end, my revenge wasn't in their humiliation, but in their eventual acceptance. It was in the fact that they were finally, truly seeing me. And I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't a grand, destructive act, but a quiet, powerful reveal. It's simply revealing who you've always been and letting the world, and your family, deal with the breathtaking reality of what they so carelessly dismissed. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible revenge stories. What would you have done in a Lathia's situation? Let me know in the comments.